Good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock, and if you are joining us now, my name is Ali FitzGibbon. I'm a senior lecturer at Queen's University Belfast, and I'm part of the research team behind the Freelancers in the Dark project. This is panel 5. We have more power than we think: creative industry, lobbying power, and the government. I think it gets the prize for one of the longest titles in this session. And I'm joined by my panelists today. So the structure, if you've already been in one of the panels, you'll know the structure is that I'll introduce the panelists we have today. I'll give a little bit of information about them, and then I'll ask them each to speak and contribute in turn on the topic that we've set. Our particular interest is about looking forward. I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping notes before I kind of move on. I can tend to get carried away, but just to say this session is being recorded for documentation. There is going to be a discussion group afterwards, which is not going to be recorded, where people can speak more freely if they wish. If you wish to use the live transcript function, you can find it in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen on Zoom, just next to the leave button. And during the course, after the different contributors kind of say their pieces, we're going to open it up to questions. So if you have questions, thoughts, comments, if there are things that the panelists bring up that you'd like them to talk a little bit more on, please pop this into the Q&A function. The chat, we can post messages out to you, but you can't reply into them. So I would focus on the Q&A, but we will open it up. I'm going to be asking the panel to talk to each other as well, and I have some kind of questions myself. It's very informal, so please feel free to kind of have an exchange. So without further ado, I'm going to say thanks to our panelists. We had originally 4 panelists for this session, but unfortunately Trevor McFarlane from Cultural Commons has had to step away due to kind of a last-minute personal circumstances, and he sends his apologies. But we still have 3 of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom represented today. So we have Laura Mackenzie-Stuart from Scotland, we have Steffan Donnelly from Wales, and we have Fionnuala Kennedy from Northern Ireland. I feel this is a major achievement. I'm used to going to events where we talk about policy, where pretty much the only thing we have represented is England, which I occasionally kind of feel a little bit kind of undermined by her. So I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order that they're going to be presenting. Our first is Laura Mackenzie-Stuart, who's head of Theatre in Creative Scotland, the national body for funding the arts, screen and creative industries. Laura leads a team of specialists supporting the overall ecology of the theatre sector, as well as advising individuals and organisations on accessing public funding via Creative Scotland and other sources. The theatre team in Creative Scotland use their national overview to identify gaps in provision and give shape to solutions. Their role is pivotal in championing the needs of the creative sector, ensuring an awareness amongst policymakers at a local and national governmental level of the contribution of theatre to the overall health and well-being of wider society. Laura was instrumental in the inception of the Association of Independent Venue Producers, bringing together industry competitors to form a cohesive advocacy and campaigning organisation. She was also elected chair in 2006 and remained in post until her appointment to Creative Scotland in 2011. Steffan Donnelly is a director, actor, writer and artistic director of Invertigo Theatre Company. He has just been announced, congratulations to Steffan, as the Next Artistic Director of Welsh Language National Theatre, Theatre Genedlaethol Cymru. His recent directing work includes, this is for Glad Iason. Is that okay?
Yes.
And short films, Mulligaw?
Monolog Gair Maes, yeah.
Oh, beautiful. His recent acting work includes Curtain Up, but for Theatre Clwyd, and Metamorphoses for Shakespeare's Globe. His plays My Body Welsh and My People are published by Bloomsbury. He is a board member of the National Theatre of Wales, Arts Connection, Kistel Kelf?
Yeah, perfect.
And is a member of Shakespeare's Globe's Creative Council. Perhaps most pertinent to today's discussion, he has been a co-founding member of the Cultural Freelancers Wales, previously the Wales Freelance Task Force, since it was started during the pandemic. And I'm going to have to jump to another screen, just 1 second. We then welcome Fionnuala Kennedy. I've suddenly lost my slide. Who is a writer and theatre director from Belfast. She was one of the first directors on Headlong's Origins programme in 2019 and was a reveal artist with Prime Cut Productions. Most recently, she has written Thaw for Replay Theatre Company's work for profound and multiple learning disability audiences, produced at the MAC in Belfast. And she was one of 10 writers on the National Theatre's Connections programme 2021-22 with a play called Hunt. And she is currently under commission for Northern Ireland Opera, writing a libretto for young people on housing rights. Fionnuala is one of the writers of the BBC Drama Room 2021-22. Possibly in the background to this and pertinent also to today's discussion is her role in the co-founding of the Northern Ireland Freelancers Surviving Corona and her involvement in the establishment of the Bread and Butter Fund, and an involvement in other networks around the support and advocacy for freelancers and freelance artists in Northern Ireland. So without further ado, each panel member has been asked to speak for roughly about 8 minutes on this topic of what is it that we are developing and learning in terms of the power that the sector has in relation to theatre freelancers, the ways in which we can influence policy, what learning has come from the pandemic that we would take forward, and what the challenges have been on how to develop effective policy for freelancers that has arisen during COVID-19. So I'm going to first ask Laura to speak, and we'll go through all the different speakers and then we'll come to questions at the end, but please put your questions in the chat. Laura, over to you.
Thank you very much. So as has been described, I work for Creative Scotland, which perhaps more simply put, is the equivalent of Arts Council England. We are the Arts Council for Scotland. Culture is a devolved matter, and that means that it's the responsibility of each of the 4 nation governments to decide how they invest in culture. So our budget comes from the Scottish Government in part, and the other part obviously from National Lottery, like the other arts councils. What that does mean is, for the purposes of this conversation, it's highly likely that experiences will be different in different parts of the UK, simply because the responses were able to be different. My role is head of theatre, and I lead a team of about 6 people, really fundamentally working on funding, so ensuring that the public funding flows through institutions, organisations and into individual projects. Theatre is perhaps a bit of an outdated label, I think, sometimes, because it encompasses what one would consider kind of classical work in proscenium arch theatres, but it also includes work in hospitals and prisons. It can be work for very specific neurodiverse audiences, for example, wherever they might be. It includes increasing amounts of cross-art form and multidisciplinary work, and actually increasingly, perhaps hastened in some respects by the COVID years, outdoor and site-specific work. And theatre does at the moment also encompass circus. So it's a very, very broad range of work, and equally a broad range of artists. While we're perhaps most visible, perhaps in the support that we give to building-based organisations, what is important to remember is that freelancers make up an overwhelming percentage, typically considered to be about 75% of those involved in the creation of work by institutions, by those multi-year funded organisations, as well as involved in the creation of independent projects. So the well-being of the freelance sector really is vital to the theatre sector as a whole. The context that we're working in at the moment, well, we're now 2 years into COVID, but one has to go back to March 2020 to remember that initially we thought that it was maybe a 12-week hiatus, that what we were doing was we were putting everything on pause, that we were then going to rapidly catch up, go back to normal, and it would all be kind of quickly forgotten. So that means that the first reactions and responses in terms of support were based on that information. And as the weeks became months and solutions kind of morphed from being about not overwhelming the NHS to not spreading the virus further through isolation, etc., and then moving on to vaccines, so too the kind of responses that were needed and the impact that the prolonged amount of time in which COVID was keeping doors shut, those responses had to change. What was very clear from the outset was that freelancers were particularly badly hit. I mean, within days we were having reports of people having all their work for up to a year being cancelled, and that was still relatively early into this this whole situation. At Creative Scotland, the first two things we were able to do very swiftly. One was to set up a hardship fund, which was purely in recognition for the lost income that people were facing, that their capacity to pay bills for what was understood to be the next 1, 2, or 3 months was going to be severely compromised. So the hardship fund was set up with a kind of no strings attached, on a no strings attached basis for individuals. We also changed our open fund, which is the one that supports projects which would normally require some kind of public facing act of investment in the creative endeavour, that we completely eliminated the need at that point for any kind of public engagement. So it was really about supporting artists to keep their own creativity up while the context was highly challenging. We then kind of moved on as it became clear that the situation was not what we originally thought. And we introduced several other funds that were orientated towards organisations, also encouraging them as part of the criteria to use any of the funding that they were accessing to engage freelancers. So again, that while that was institutional support, it was asking them and requiring them to see at least part of that funding as being part of their responsibility to kind of flow the benefit through the system and on out to freelancers. More recently, we've had a cancellation fund for freelancers, as well as a second one for organisations, and that was to recognise the fact that there had been this opening again last year, only for doors to have to shut again. And then finally, and most recently, we've had a second round of hardship, which was something initially we didn't think we were going to have to do. We really had thought and hoped that by that stage, the kind of recommissioning process and the representing process would be up and running. While the first two were pretty spontaneous and reactive, the next raft of funds was very much, they were developed very much in tandem with unions, with sector bodies, with commissioning institutions. And it's really through them that we were hearing the voices of freelancers. That channeling of the experiences and opinions of freelancers, I think, has been effective, highly effective. And I think when we come to talk more about that, the power of that voice, the marshalling of it through those who have a seat at the table of policymakers, has proven to be really very effective. Everybody has been working with shifting contexts, so it has been a challenge to keep pace at times with what that need really is. Interestingly, and I'll take this is a kind of reflection from my theatre perspective, it's when looking at the theatre industry, we are in fact relatively well placed to make the case on what need is, what the kind of costs are of working in the ways that we choose to work. It has been really revealing to me seeing colleagues, particularly, for example, in the music industry, really tussle with the fact that there's much less in the way of structure, perhaps due to the fact that theatre is quite a big machine that takes time to turn around, that tends to work to longer lead times, tends to work with kind of union, if not to union contracts, to union recommended rates. And contracting is largely a feature of producing and planning. In other industries and in music is something I really noticed, where everything is so informal that actually for those artists trying to prove that they had the work in the first case, for example, to be able to access cancellation funding was a real hiccup. So it'd be interesting to see to what extent people actually adapt the way they work to perhaps protect themselves a bit better in the future. Hopefully not for the same reasons, but there may be different reasons why one would actually want to have a bit more security around the kind of working conditions. What is clear is there's still, regardless, a kind of an immense precarity in working as a freelancer, and that does need to feed into future thinking about funding. But at the same time, it's trying to find that challenge of not losing the flexibility which freelance working affords many people, but finding a kind of balance of that greater security, and also to reflect what the theatre sector needs and can afford. I was kind of thinking what maybe we would have done differently had we known what we know now. Perhaps, you know, we might have reached a point where we would have kind of been supporting presenting work outdoors faster in recognition of the greater safety of being outside. We might have taken a different approach with schools, even creating a kind of much greater expanded role for the arts in schools rather than withdrawing virtually everything from there. Maybe as a real kind of advancement, we could have trialed UBI, Universal Basic Income. Who knows? I mean, there are many things that perhaps we could have done. But I think, to conclude, really, the way forward for now, really trying to harness what we have learned over these last couple of years will come from events like this, and the kind of the wider sector discussions, and trying to understand what the flow through of information is, how that pool of information can be refined and delivered in front of the right people at the right time, while understanding similarly what governments, local and national, are trying to achieve through the policies that they have. There's one thing for certain: they have learned more about the machinery of how the arts work in the last 2 years than they ever imagined they would. And I think that is really a point from which we can really capitalize, because there's a much greater understanding of what it takes to have a healthy, functioning creative sector. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing other panelists, and to those of you who are able to fire over some questions as part of this session. All of that does feed into wider thinking. So hopefully that's been a bit of a canter.
No, that's
but
great.
I hope it's
I'm making a note of your optimism of kind of the understanding of the machinery, and I'd be interested to hear from our other panelists whether they've observed the same thing. So thank you, Laura. That's really great. We will come back to a wider discussion. I'm now going to move and ask Steffan to make a contribution. Steffan, fire away.
Diolch yn fawr, thank you very much. As Ali mentioned, I'm an actor, director, and writer. I'm from Anglesey in North Wales, and it's great to be here at this really brilliant conference. I thought I'd just talk a bit about the situation in Wales, what Cultural Freelancers Wales, Laura Mackenzie-Stuart has been doing since the pandemic started. That's the collective that I'm a part of in Wales. And then maybe finish off with a bit of information about the report and recent statistics that we launched at the start of this year. So Cultural Freelancers Wales, Llawryddion Celfyddydol Cymru, is a diverse collective of cultural freelancers in Wales from lots of different cultural disciplines, with an aim to strengthen the freelance voice, as well as offering inclusive support to fellow freelancers through lots of different projects that we've been running over the last 2 years. And one of the key aspects of strengthening that voice has been sort of lobbying work, or talking with key stakeholders about what things are like for freelancers. We've been running since May 2020. We were previously called the Wales Freelance Task Force, and that's because we were set up as part of Fuel's open letter, which was signed by dozens of organisations committing to fund a national freelance task force. So that's how we began. And then we were supported by an Arts Council of Wales grant last year, and we're awaiting funding now for 22 to 23. Our partners are Arts and Business Cymru, Disability Arts Cymru, People Make It Work, and Race Council Cymru. So what culture is devolved in Wales. We have a deputy minister for arts and sport. That means that they don't actually sit in cabinet. They're a deputy minister, but still, there is that port of call. And then there's also Creative Wales, which is possibly Laura, a little different to Creative Scotland, because we have Arts Council of Wales, but Creative Wales is an agency set up within Welsh Government. And what we did was we sent a letter to them asking that we could talk, and this was a huge steep learning curve for all of us, because we had never been involved in anything like this before. And the Arts Council of Wales Stabilisation Fund was going on, but we were convinced that we needed further support, and there was rumblings around this idea of a cultural recovery fund, and we really wanted to push that a percentage of that fund should be put directly into freelancers' pockets, and not relying on a kind of trickle-down idea from organisations to freelancers, which is sort of rife with the politics of all of that. So we were asking for about 25 to 30% of any cultural recovery fund to go directly to freelancers. And in the end, I think we calculated we achieved through work with partners and everything, about 17% of the cultural recovery fund went to freelancers. And out of the 53 million initially announced, 7 million went as direct funding to freelancers, and then we campaigned for a top up in November of 3.5 million. And then once the precedent of supporting freelancers had been set, it was quite possible then to ask how this investment was going to be protected by further investment, given that the pandemic was very much still a major problem. So in February 21, a figure of 8.9 million was committed as an overall figure. So in total, across that period of time, around 3,400 grants of 2.5 grand went to freelancers across that period. And we started off by talking, and trying to gather data that was already available. And Arts Council of Wales had, I think they sent me like a couple of pages, but it wasn't really near enough the detail that even Creative Wales was asking for quite directly. I remember someone said, we know what a widget maker in the Rhondda does. It's really fixed. We know the price, we know everything. But with freelancers, because we're so disparate, there is none of that really clear data that they needed. So we went ahead and launched a big data drive. And then we published a report called Rebalancing and Reimagining. And that was really useful because we were suddenly kind of talking the way that, in a way, they wanted us to talk. So that was quite a big learning. And it also gave us this ammo, which wasn't just, a bunch of freelancers saying, oh, we're in crisis, we need money. It was very clear to kind of see what the damage was and how far-reaching this damage was going to be, particularly to certain communities, and also a community that I was really concerned about was Welsh language freelancers and those who operate and make work in Welsh language culture. And then we were sort of brought on to consult a bit on how this fund would be dispersed. And we asked for things like the provision of evidence to be less time consuming and less intrusive in terms of privacy. For 2 rounds instead of a rush into 1 round. We pushed for a streamlined system that was to be accessible, a suspension of this requirement that 50% of income should derive from self-employed work. This had hampered a lot of freelancers with the SEISS fund, because that was a condition of that fund. And stuff like, not needing a track record with Arts Council Wales, for example. And then there were, the fund went out and there were problems with the fund. It was initially a first come, first serve basis, which is something we didn't want them to do. But again, because of their capacity, they couldn't do it in another way. But this did have the negative effect that then, the really popular local authorities like Cardiff, for example, sort of sold out a bit like Glastonbury, people were saying on Twitter, that all those grants had gone in about 45 minutes. And of course, that's really unfair to have a kind of race for cash in that way, given people's caring commitments and all sorts. So we sort of leveraged that to give additional incentive to have a further chunk of money, so that the money didn't just vanish. But again, this was because they didn't have data, I think, on where freelancers were, what local authorities were they based, how many were there. So this was also really useful work that was happening to gather data on where people are located and how many. And so, yeah, I'm really happy to answer any questions about that relationship with Creative Wales, but we were then developing quite a good relationship, I think, where it was a major learning curve for us, but we could also keep really transparent with the freelancers that we were talking with, something we didn't feel always that the unions were doing. And it felt quite refreshing to be having these conversations and to be open, and to have also a government that was listening. And I was looking over the border to my colleagues still knocking on the door of DCMS. And so, there's a lot to be said for how agile and how caring, Creative Wales and the Deputy Minister was actually in at least listening and then going forward to respond to these concerns. As part of this fund, there was a something for something aspect that ministers wanted, which was a pledge between freelancers and the public service sector in Wales. So we were asked to join a working group which included freelancers, unions and councils to explore an idea of whether there could be a kind of portal where freelancers and the public sector could work more closely together, where there'd be job opportunities, and where freelancers would be able to help solve some of the social challenges being faced by people across Wales. And I think this was, I'm sure other panelists will speak about how this was something, I think, that was really important to put forward. Why is art important? Why is always putting forward the case for culture when there are so many other competing elements, and particularly when you're looking at what's happening with health and education and stuff like that. So this sort of closer working and embedding freelancers into communities, into the NHS is a huge part of this pledge. And I'm just checking how we're doing on time, because I've talked quite a bit. I'll just talk for a couple more minutes. But some things that came out of this pledge was, do we need this pledge? Because some of this work is already happening with the Wales Arts and Health Network. There were questions like, how do you house all the ideas from all the different freelancers within this setting, working group setting, which is quite formal, and also quite clear who the stakeholders are, whereas we were a group of freelancers with lots of different ideas. So how can we create a way that can harness all of these ideas and develop them in a way that still keeps, government interest and keep obviously the momentum of this moving on. The working group came to a close, and there were some recommendations that came out of it to try and develop this pledge. And just before this, actually, I spoke to Creative Wales to see what was happening, because it's gone quite quiet. And they say because of capacity, they're going to look at it again in April, but they're still very much focused on developing it. But I think that would be something as well that I've learned from this or a question rather, how do we keep momentum, particularly given all these different competing interests and capacity? And, for example, us, Cultural Freelancers, we're in a place now where we don't have funding. So how do we get a funding model that is sustainable? And the intensity and pace of change at that time feels less emphatic now. So how do we keep that going? And this conference is obviously a great one for that as well. And one of the ways that we also thought we'd do that was by doing a follow-up data set. So we published at the start of this year, Road to Recovery, which was looking at, what is the road to recovery, and our recommendations to cultural organisations, Arts Council Wales and Welsh Government fell into 6 main categories, which was improving infrastructure and geographic equity, improving diversity and inclusivity, strengthening Welsh language work, changing organisational governance to be more effective and supportive of freelancers, investing in cultural freelancers and rebalancing systems, as well as improving funding and accountability processes. And that again, looked at where freelancers were, and if we compared the study that we did in 2020 to 21, it showed that the longer COVID-19 was continuing, the worse impact it was having on freelancers' well-being. And our data showed that freelancers with protected characteristics, or those who had caring responsibilities, faced additional barriers to support and are at greater risk of leaving the industry. So if anything, we were sort of hopeful that maybe this new data set would show a lot of, small but positive improvements, but it shows that actually, it's still affecting freelancers who make up about half the cultural sector in Wales, and that we see that continuing as these long-term effects. And in a way, the feeling of kind of lottery of reopening now is happening. And I think that's it from me. That gives a kind of whistle-stop tour of everything.
So we'll circle back, because there's lots in there, and lots of connections to be made with kind of Laura's contribution, her perspective and what she was seeing. And what I find very interesting, and it keeps kind of coming up to me, is the speed at which change had to happen in the first 6 months of the pandemic actually made, while nobody wants to work at that pace of change and uncertainty again, it actually made it possible to see how certain immovable things could be dismantled quite quickly when they had to be, which is kind of an interesting note I would put a pin in. I'm going to move on and ask Fionnuala to make her contribution, and then hopefully we'll open up for a conversation. Don't forget, if you have questions, to put them into.
Thank you, guys. I'm being tortured by my dog at the minute, so hopefully she'll stay quiet.
This is a dog welcome space. I have a cat.
So I just want to preface this with the fact that what I'm talking about is specific to Northern Ireland. When freelancers started rallying across both these islands, we were invited to join some of the UK-based campaigns. But because of our different government structures, we felt some of the campaigns weren't necessarily relevant to us, and we needed to put the time into campaigning here. So I'm really grateful to have an opportunity to participate in this today and hear all the great things that have been done across both islands. So I'm a writer and director from Belfast. I began my career in production for a theatre company, and during this time we were always invited to lobbying meetings when there were changes or cuts to the arts. When I went freelance full-time in 2015, I realized these conversations were happening mostly without freelancers. I feel like there might be an idea that freelancers don't understand the funding structure, or perhaps they don't know the facts and figures. But when campaigns were created, we were to lend our support to them. And honestly, I couldn't understand some of them. And I work in the arts, and the argument of 13p in every pound for blah, blah, per blah doesn't mean anything to me. But we were told this is how to speak to politicians: talk figures, talk money. So pre-pandemic, we got behind those campaigns. When we saw our companies at risk and potential job losses, we were there representing. We were one sector. So when the pandemic hit and freelancers lost their livelihoods overnight, the silence of our companies and venues, with the exception of a few, floored me. I cannot express enough what a blow this was, because I felt like we were there when jobs were at risk, and this was a situation of jobs completely gone, and there didn't seem to be any panic. So during the first lockdown here, so much leadership was shown from our freelancers. People had set up online events, groups, festivals, podcasts. I set up a group to share information on benefits and funding. I supported playwright Abby Spaulding to administer the Bread and Butter Fund, which was an emergency fund for arts workers. We raised just over £30,000, and 10,000 of that came directly from our minister responsible for arts funding. So within a week, a government department donated £10,000 to an online GoFundMe page. We were incredibly grateful for this, but I think it's really important to note how quickly and directly that support was given when we're often told that there's no money and direct funding isn't possible. When these conversations were happening about sector-wide recovery, freelancers were consulted at times in small bits, but were never at the table. We asked repeatedly to be part of conversations, but again, there appeared to be an understanding that freelancers don't know the system or the bureaucracy or the strategies. And even though some people were handpicked for small opportunities to speak to government alongside our salaried colleagues, the ask was still to increase support for the current system. The idea was that investing in the companies and venues would trickle down to freelancers. And this is perfect if everyone has an equal opportunity to access work. The pandemic highlighted that this wasn't the case. So I just want to go off on a slight tangent, but it leads to where we kind of went next. So in my spare time, I'm part of a campaign group based in Belfast. They're led by an organisation called Participation and Practice of Rights, which is the PPR project. So they're an organisation that supports people to fight for their rights and lead grassroots campaigns on things like housing and welfare. So they empower people to claim their rights through activism. They don't do it for them. I joined their Right to Work, Right to Welfare group in about 2015, and we campaigned for changes to the welfare system. So PPR teach you to ignore the current rules and procedures and go straight to the top of the chain, gathering support and making noise to get through the door and be heard. We have refused to follow the instructions of the welfare process, and in doing this have got money put back into the accounts of vulnerable people who were stripped of their benefits without due process. However, these small wins are not the main goal. PPR teach you that change can be slow. You will fail most of the time, but persistent campaigning can hammer away at a broken system until changes are made. So I kind of wanted to use some of what I learned from campaigning with PPR and see if we could bring it into our campaign for the arts. I got together with some freelancers to discuss the impact of COVID, and we discovered that our problems didn't necessarily start with the pandemic, but way before. And we didn't want to hit the reset button. We wanted an overhaul of the system, but small steps. So it began with deciding on a clear ask and came from our frustration that in both islands, Northern Ireland is the only place where individual arts workers cannot access project funding. So this means we're effectively at the mercy of companies and venues to get work made. It also means that many people felt that speaking out against inequality of opportunity might jeopardize their career or reputation. So therefore this campaign isn't for everyone, and that's okay. We kept being warned not to be divisive, that our campaign might show division in the sector and dilute the general message to support the arts, but we weren't included in that message and felt like it wasn't reflective of what a lot of us needed. People suggested that somehow our campaign might seem like it was freelancers against the companies and venues, or that even it was a personal attack. Many people in the companies are my friends, have given me work and so much support. We were just simply pointing out that the opportunity wasn't equal and that should be okay. So our first step was to create a list of recommendations for allocation of some of the emergency funding to make the creation of work more equitable. We asked for an independent arts fund, allowing artists full control and credit over their own work, and 3 additional strands of funding for artists from minority ethnic communities, deaf artists and those with a disability, and artists from lower income backgrounds. These additional strands were simply to make the point of the lack of recognition of everyone's needs, experiences, and access to opportunity, because of course everyone should be able to apply for the main project fund, but it also meant they couldn't ignore it. So we made the letter public and we sent it right to the top to the minister responsible for the arts, and we asked for a meeting. Some companies shared our letter in support. We then got an invitation to meet with the Chief Executive of the Arts Council, who acknowledged they had never met a group, they've never met with freelancers. So the meeting was 3 hours long and it was tense at times, but the Arts Council agreed to explore what we were asking. months after they commissioned a piece of research to see if freelancers were interested in new models of working. And they explained to us that this was a tool for them to make a case for project funding. At the moment, we're awaiting this year's funding allocation to be announced. I don't think there will be a strand for freelancers, but I'm confident it's something we can push through in the future with sustained campaigning. I'm going to stop talking, but I just want to sum up. There's always a risk when challenging dominant structures, and often claiming your rights means acknowledging your worth. And I think that can be hard, especially for arts workers. The pandemic was great for showing us the power of freelancers rallying, and this has to continue. We cannot lose our power. In terms of answering how the industry can become better at lobbying, I would say we need to be careful that we're not lobbying for support of the current structure, because it excludes so many from access and opportunity, and we can't accept this. The argument that more investment in the current system will create these opportunities is pointless if those making the decisions are not reflective of the workforce and therefore don't know the needs. Because of the work done by freelancers and through issues highlighted by campaigns like Black Lives Matter, we've seen small positive changes, but these are the small wins. And I hope they're not temporary solutions until the status quo returns. The pandemic saw the rules go out the window. There's always possibility for changes to the system when we're told it's not possible, but we need to engage the public in our campaigns. I don't think we can ignore the arts versus hospital beds argument, especially at a time when poverty levels are at the highest, but we can make the bread and roses argument. People deserve, can have, and should have both of these things. But having people that are representative of the public leading the campaigns, for me, is key. Famous people are all well and good, but it's not representative of the workforce, and it's crucial that we articulate the right message to the public and our funders, or I think lobbying might be pointless. I know that sounds like a bit of a negative note to end on, and Ali, you said to focus on solutions, but I think it's really important moving forward with lobbying that we recognise the flaws in our current system and harness and continue all the brilliant work that has been done so far to make positive change.
That's great. Thanks, Fionnuala. Yeah, I want solutions, but we have to actually kind of unpacking what we're trying to solve. I'm a big fan of kind of saying, well, what actually is the problem that's trying to be fixed? That we're trying to address collectively. So I'm going to open it out. Now, we have one kind of quite practical question about the recording of sessions. Will the recorded sessions be available to us afterwards? And the answer is yes. These recorded sessions are going to be made available through the project website, and also I think on YouTube, but actually the discussion session we'll have afterwards won't be recorded. So moving on from there, we don't have other questions in the Q&A at the moment, but if you want to ask a question, you can type live into the Q&A and we can kind of open up your mic for that. I'm going to ask the panel to unmute and ask, do you have questions for each other? Laura?
It's perhaps just a little bit of a request from Steffan just to talk a little bit more about that pledge that you were talking about, because there's something really interesting about the degree to which it's obviously got quite embedded within Welsh government, which to me sounds like something that possibly wouldn't have happened before, but that kind of bringing the nitty-gritty right into the kind of heart of the decision making, or the wider planning, does really sound quite unusual. I understand it's a bit on pause at the moment, but that as a model could be something really important, because the one thing I would say is the challenge that lobbying has is how to funnel the most important issues across, because if you put 1,000 freelancers in a room, you will have 1,000 separate and different experiences and probably 1,000 different needs, which can't all be met. So having effective mechanisms to try and distill which of those have the greatest commonality and therefore can be the kind of focus for attention seems to be the nut that we're all trying to crack.
Yeah,
exactly, Laura. And I think that was the really tricky thing with the discussions that we were having, because going back a bit to the idea of, which freelancers have been picked, there was a question about that, and we instantly wanted to sort of change the makeup of who was, how many freelancers we had, for example, compared to how many. So, there's a bit of work that we had to do there, even before we could even sort of have the conversations. And then once we were into the conversations, you're right, it's about how do you get enough shared common threads that can then be matched with a system that actually pushes those things through and creates effective working between the public sector and freelancers. And some people really didn't think that a portal was the right way, but then at the same time you had the fact that this working group was a task and finish group, so there was an end point. And there was a feeling of, well, also if we say no, by the end of this task finish, well, great, there was a working group, and the idea was really that we didn't want a portal, and there we go, that's done, and then it'll never happen. So it's always full of kind of, I think, tension for us as freelancers, because we obviously want things to happen, but we also, like Fionnuala was saying, we need to be able to do it in a way that works for the most freelancers, for every freelancer, and make sure that we're not just replicating systems. Because, one of the things that was a big point of concern in that group was, are we just replicating old things? And perhaps some of these things exist already. For example, National Theatre Wales have a kind of community page where people can, speak and post job opportunities and things. There are also like the Wales Arts and Health Network and stuff like this happening. So we didn't want to tread on any toes either, but really try and create a place where all of these things could come together. And there would be substantial investment there from government to try and create this. But it's just about making sure that along every step of the way, I think that there is that really close working, and I think allowing a space for things to be questioned. But I think that was one of the great positives of that working group, is that we were talking with civil servants, there were union leaders as well, and there were council leaders, and we were being able to have these conversations, which felt really refreshing and really rare, compared to the last 10 years that I've been in the sector. And really, there's none of that conversation that can happen. So you're right, it feels like a big step forward. And I think because there's been CRF3 coming out in January and February, Creative Wales have been really busy with that. But they say in April, it's going to get picked up again. So hopefully we can watch this space and see how they develop this portal.
Yeah. One thing, Steffan, and I'm keen to bring Fionnuala in on this as well, but one thing I noticed in looking at the cultural freelancers and the pledge is that it seems to have kind of gained root in the governmental structures, possibly not entirely coincidentally connected to sustainable development goals, that the timing of when it was really gaining momentum was at the point when the Welsh government was thinking about things like, sustainable production and beginning to join the dots between that, kind of almost like a fair trade principles. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that's right. And we also have a piece of legislation called the Future of Wellbeing, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales, right, which is a piece of legislation which has about 9, and it's very closely linked to a lot of the development goals. And it's a really incredible piece of legislation. And there's a commissioner who looks after that work, and a whole team who try and push forward the future generations' recommendations in every aspect of public life in Wales. And there's obviously a huge bit of it about culture, and a key part of that is seeing how culture can support other aspects of our society, like education and like health and social prescribing and stuff like this. So it feels like, a lot of the work was sort of using the Future Gen Act as a kind of hook. And this would tie in with a lot of their goals.
Yeah, I'm conscious that in the kind of pre-pandemic world, there was always a real anxiety when the arts world in general, not just theatre, felt attached to bigger government policies, that there was a feeling of having policy done to the sector rather than done with the sector. And it strikes me that this is possibly part of an argument of going back up in the other way and saying, in order to deliver bigger government policy, actually that policy has to be informed by culture in a curious way. can I bring Fionnuala? I think I think your work, obviously your creative work, has also been influenced by your interests in things like welfare rights and, over a period of time. But can you see, or some of what I think you have been doing is connecting into kind of human rights arguments?
It is, Ali, but it's funny because sometimes I think, and I have benefited from the idea that I am a social issue based writer, but I say because I am a working class writer, I'm writing about what I see in my own community. Mm-hmm. But sometimes that is viewed as being social issue based. And it does annoy me when people, when artists say that they don't want to have to do that work or tick those boxes, because it is public money at the same time. But I also think we need to flip it in a way, because I did a project last year, and it was funded by a government department, and it was all about building a better community. But it was like they had created this form for people to respond about how they had grown throughout the project. And the questions were completely ridiculous. It was like someone had sat in a room and went, how do we measure data on this? So we were asking young kids from an Indian community, who were 6 years old, if they felt less racist at the end of this thing, or adults with learning difficulty, if they, all of these kind of things that the government went, this is what the arts should do. And in fact, if they were engaged with us more, to kind of let us do the project and work with us to kind of come up with those outcomes that would be better, would actually, get the work done that they want to achieve. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. Can you talk a little bit more about, so when you were talking about, so one of the things I noticed, in the way you were speaking, is your observations were very focused on a lot of the relationships internally within the art sector in Northern Ireland. And there are that sense of not wanting to appear divisive is it's a common message that I think goes way, way back before the pandemic. And I'm wondering kind of what of that can we dismantle? If it's dismantled, what does the new version of lobbying or advocacy look like? Not an easy question.
Ali. I mean, I will be really honest. I think it's a simple solution. I really do. And I said it to our companies at venues as well when we had meetings, is just bring freelancers into the room. And of course, I know, Laura, you were saying it's not possible to bring in, and everybody will have different experiences. But at the minute, our government set up a creative task force last year, and there was one freelancer. So there were different arts bodies and different companies and venues, and one freelancer representing the entirety. When we say that, the workforce represents 80% of the sector. So I do think it's a simple solution. Just go open the doors and engage. And I know that sounds so simple, but actually it's not happening here in Northern Ireland. I just received an email today that was a forward of an invite to, because we've an election coming up, and we've, the question is, do arts matters to Stormont and our government? And this was kind of forwarded on to me. And I know if I'm getting it, loads of other people won't be getting it. And that room will most likely be full of companies and venues. I mean, just even make it 50-50 or just even increase, it really will. It's those small changes and I just don't understand what the threat is. Do you know what I mean? I don't understand what the threat is of just having a freelancer and talking to them and saying what those needs are. To anybody?
Yeah. Can I bring Laura in? I can see you're kind of champing at the bit, and I know that kind of having spoken to you before, you've kind of gotten a sensibility to this from working in the sector and also working in the role that you've been in for some years.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of it is in the heads of everybody from all angles. There's the sort of fear maybe from those within the large institutions, governmental institutions, that they don't fully understand, and therefore they kind of hide behind what they do know. There's a fear in individuals that there's an awful lot going on that they don't know about, that somehow they're being kind of locked out of, whereas the reality is much more mundane. And I think what has been good during these last couple of years is a kind of breaking down of some of those partitions, not necessarily that means that everything is suddenly really rosy, but I think there is a better understanding of what everybody's actually getting on with and what those challenges are, and that it's not about shutting out, it's often just about not finding the ways to engage as effectively. Language is one of those barriers, and the kind of language that comes from institutions plays out in a way that is almost instantly quite intimidating if you're not regularly using it. In Scotland, we created an organisation called Culture Counts to try and mitigate some of that, which was, it's kind of 1.5 people working, but what they're doing is working with 40 plus organisations to draw in the data and information that can be used as an advocacy tool, and recycling that information into the kind of formats that policymakers are more used to seeing, so that when this information lands on their desks, they are actually able to kind of equate like for like. They can read that information a bit more easily and understand how to engage with it. Okay.
I'm getting a note here that we have to start wrapping up, and I'm like going, oh, we can keep going. So it may be that we'll kind of take another we'll kind of finish up in a couple of minutes, and then we'll take a comfort break and then move into the discussion, which is in the, let me have a quick look, in the writer's room. I love this little kind of virtual space. But I just to pick up on that, one thing I noticed with because I think Culture Counts is very interesting in giving the kind of the tools of the data. One thing I noticed in the kind of mapping that happened in Wales was the fact that the funds were distributed through local authorities made people realise just how distributed creative freelancers were. And also some of the work that's through the creative clusters has actually then created a kind of a visible map that certainly in terms of political awareness, I think it's hugely significant. Steffan, could you say any more about that?
Yeah, definitely. It's really important, I think, to keep, because I think what can happen in Wales is that it can go very Cardiff centric and very south. And of course, that is where a lot of freelancers are based, and that's why a lot of those South local authorities sort of filled up their quota out of that first round of the fund with really problematic and frustrating consequences. But it did also show where other freelancers were based, and you kind of find these little clusters of, wow, there's so many like arts and crafts freelancers based in this little bit of Powys. And so I think it sort of raised awareness for government where people were, but also what type of work was being done across Wales and how to support that, particularly like our report talks about infrastructure or being able to have proper internet, and stuff like how woefully inadequate the public transport system in Wales is. It's kind of all of those stuff then start to creep up in a really interesting way. And one of the things that has happened with Cluster is the Creative Economy Atlas. And maybe I'll just do a quick screen share because this shows where
I'm getting a shout going. I have to wrap up now.
Okay, fine. Well, the Creative Economy Atlas is worth looking at, and that's a way of connecting.
If we can share it in the discussion, that would be great. So thank you, everybody, and we'll jump over we'll meet you in the writers' room. Go and get 10-minute break and open up, a packet of biscuits, and we'll see you in 10 minutes to continue the discussion. Thank you.